Okay, so for the binding portion of this, you don't need to bind the handle because that's, uh, solid, it's rigid, so it won't be moving at all. You only need to bind the thong in the transition. But with this, because we only went several inches on the thong, there won't need to be as much binding. Normally, if this was at least a 6-foot whip, you would go down, back down, halfway, back up, and then down the transition and back up again. So you do a total of 3 times. But with this, we're probably only going to do about twice because it's a shorter whip. So with a 4, maybe a 5-foot whip, you only need to go down and back up about twice for the first belly anyway. So start about an inch, maybe 2 inches above the transition, and pull as tight as you can from the start. And you're going to come down to where you had left off from binding these strands. Don't pull very tight down here because you don't want it to be super tight and then loose. It's going to cause a kink. So don't. I like to keep it kind of loose and come down about an inch past that point and then back up. And you want the whip to taper in size, but you also want it to taper in rigidity. So whenever you're binding, you need to bind with tapered rigidity. So the farther down you get, the looser you need to bind. Of course, when you're actually binding, don't do it loose, but don't pull as tight as you possibly can. But as you get back up closer to the transition, and especially within the 2 or 3 inches of it, is when you want to pull as tight as you can. Go back up about an inch above it, and then go back down. And like I said, if this was a 6-foot whip or longer, you would go back down 2/3 of the braided portion, back up, and then back down 1/3 of the braided portion and back up. But because this whip is so short on this belly, I'm only going to go back down to get the transition area. So that's only about half the braided portion. And before you move on to the next belly, you always want to double check your transition, especially to make sure there's no weak points on it and that it's well tapered. So I'm going to go up a few more inches and then grab my thread. Just pull that through. So now, as you can see, The transition is very stiff, which is exactly what we want. So now we just have one final step to complete this belly, and that's rolling it. Something I want to mention real quick, if you're making a pair of whips, make sure that as you're braiding one, you have the other one next to it. I just finished the first belly on this, and I bound it. So now I'm working on the other one. I'm constantly taking this one, lining it up and comparing them so I know exactly when to drop strands, because you want to drop strands in the exact same place as well, and trimming them and everything. As many details as you can get to be the same as possible, the better the whip. So because when you make a matched pair of whips, you want them to be identical in weight, feel, and everything, or else it'll make cracking them two-handed very difficult. Okay, so now we're ready to roll the first belly of this whip. So go ahead and get your board and just lay your whip out and just put your weight into it and roll it back and forth. Shift it down and do this all the way down the braided portion of your belly. Okay, so you can't tell so much on camera, but you'll notice it's a much smoother finish after rolling, and all the braiding lays in a whole lot better, and it just looks better with each belly as you move on through the making of this whip. So now we're ready to go on to the next step. Okay, so for the second belly, you're going to go ahead and cut out 4 strands. For this 4-foot whip, I'm doing 2 11.5-foot strands, 1 10-foot strand, and 1 7.5-foot strand. So go ahead and take two of the strands and wrap them around like we did before. Left side comes under across the right, and the ones on the right cross over top to the left. And then we'll just form a loop so we can feed the other strands through. And again, make sure when you tie the knots to find the middles of the strands, the 2 strands that are the same length, which should be the longest strands, tie knots in the exact middles, then the rest of them stagger them a couple of inches. Okay, so now we're going to be in an 8-plat. So the bottom strand on top points to the upper right, so take the top right strand around the back and go under 2 over 2. Pull that across. And again, at the beginning, don't pull too tight just yet. Okay, so now we'll take the top left around the back and go under 2 over 2. And just continue this pattern. Slide this up. And once you've taken all the strands through a pass, that's when I like to pull each one as tight as possible. So just one more pass after this. So now I've plaited each strand individually, so slide it up, make sure it's up all the way, and then pull each strand as tight as you can. Okay, so just continuing this pattern, and if you're comfortable with this, you can try another pattern just for the handle to make it go a little bit faster. Just grab 2 strands, the top 2 strands, and then go around and go under 2 over 2. Make sure they don't twist. Check the back of the whip, make sure they're not overlapping or anything. But if you're still not comfortable with plaiting just yet, then don't try this. But again, if you're experienced with plaiting, then you can go ahead and try this pattern just for the handle. Okay, so I'm about an inch away from the transition here, and if you've been doing this alternate plait, go ahead and switch back to the standard herringbone. Just take one and go under 2 over 2, because you want this transition area to be very tight. And something to keep in mind as you're plaiting each belly of the whip, you want your plaiting to be straight. So as you can see on the whip handle, the seam of the whip runs straight. It's not twisting all around, and you want to try to maintain that the whole length of the whip on each layer or belly that we're plaiting. Okay, so I'm 16 inches down from the tip of the handle, and you can see this strand here is getting kind of short, so I'm getting ready to drop this. You can see I'm right above where I had dropped all the strands from the first belly. There's about an inch until that point, so I'm going to go ahead and drop this strand here. And we'll do it just like before. Just braid until it comes on top, and just leave it behind and ignore it. Okay, so I'm just gonna set that up there out of the way, and take the one below it. So now on this side I'll go under 2 over 1, and then on the left side it's still under 2 over 2, but only for a little bit. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and drop this strand here now that it's on top. So now we'll do under 2 over 1 on both sides. And it'll continue like this for a little bit until we come to run out of the next strand. Okay, so at this point I'm at 24.5 inches from the start of the handle, and you can see the strand is very short here. From the first belly you can see where I have the tape covering the BBs, and then there's 2 more strands that we bound off from the first belly. I'm going to go ahead and drop this top left strand here, So I'm in a 5 plait now, under 1 over 1, and then under 2 over 1. And I'm going to go 1 or 2 more passes of the other strand before I drop it. And I'm going to go ahead and drop it now, so just take the next strand under it. And now we're in a 4 plait. And you can see I don't have very much left, so I'm only going to do this for a couple more inches, and then we'll bind it off. And I'm going to go ahead and stop right about here. As you can see, there's a couple inches of the binding on the core, and then a couple inches of the core left. So go ahead and get the artificial sinew. And bind this off. Well, first we want to cut these so they stagger. Leave the longest one as it is. And then take these other 3 and stagger them. I'm doing it in about 1 to 2 inch increments. Just want it to be relatively even. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So now I'll go ahead and bind it off. And again, for this part, you don't want to pull very tight. Go ahead and spread out the strands so they wrap around the core. Not all bunched up in one spot. Okay, so I just went down and came back up, so I'm going to go ahead and take my thread and wrap it in itself there. Just give it a couple of wraps. Okay, so make sure whenever you come down, the last strand that is dropped, which is right here, you go just a little bit past, but not too much. You want to leave 2 or 3 inches of the core unwrap because we're probably going to cut about that much off when we braid the overlay. So now next we'll go ahead and cut these dropped strands off, and then we'll bind it. Okay, if you're making a match set of whips, before you bind each belly, you want to make sure that you drop the strands in the same places. So once you finish one, leave the dropped strands uncut, so then you can compare with the other one as you make it. You can see I dropped the strands in the same places on each of them. So anytime you're making a whip with each belly, especially the overlay, just constantly take the other whip and hold it next to it to see exactly where you need to drop strands and anything else. So do that before you bind each belly. So now we'll go ahead and bind this one. Okay, so once you've trimmed all your strands off, go ahead and put your whip in the vise and we'll bind this second belly. And to make it easier, I've tied a piece of paracord to the end of the core and then tied it off to a chair, just so I have both hands to work with. This makes it a lot easier. So go ahead and start about an inch above the transition on the handle like we always do. And this will be your last chance to bind, because next we're going to put on the overlay. So make sure that you bind this as tight as possible on the transition, of course, and then you want to remember to give it some tapered rigidity. So we're gonna do this 3 times because there's more length to it. So I'm gonna go all the way down to where I dropped off all the last 4 strands, back up, back down 2/3 of the way, back up, and then just the transition area. So I'm pulling as tight as I can for the first couple inches of the transition. Then after that, I'm loosening just a little bit, but not very much. And about 2/3 of the way down, so I'm going to loosen up just a little bit more. About the same tension as when you were binding the dropped strands to hold them on. And you're going to go just a little bit past where you started binding here, just 1 or 2 wraps, and then back up, because you don't want there to be a kink. And as you spiral back up, try to go across the spots you missed. Cover up any space that's not covered in sinew. Now I'm putting a little bit more tension on this. And now you're pulling as tight as you can. And now you'll just go back down about 2/3 of the way. And go back down one more time, just over the transition area. So you're going to pull as tight as you can this entire time. Okay, just several inches down and then go back up. So by the time you're done, the transition area should cover up, or there should hardly be any paracord sticking out. You should see mostly just artificial sinew. I'm going to go a little bit up the handle and go ahead and get your loop and put that in. Give it a couple of wraps. And go ahead and take your whip out, and like I said, this is the last time we're binding, so you really want to make sure that there's nothing wrong at this point. If there's any kinks, or if the transition area is loose at all or floppy, then go back over it with some sinew. But, as you can see, just holding this whip up like this, it's pretty stiff, and that's what we want. It's hardly bending at all. So once I put the overlay on and get the full length of the whip, this will be a very springy whip. So you can see here in the transition, if you pull down closer to the end, it doesn't just kink in one place. It shares all the tension for flexing, and that's exactly what you want. So now we're ready to roll this. So now we're ready to put on the overlay. Okay, so now we're ready to put the overlay on these whips. So for this, again, this is a 4-foot bullwhip. So if you're doing 4 foot, you want to cut 3 18.5-foot strands, 1 14-foot strand, 1 12-foot strand, and 1 8-foot strand. Okay, and that's for 12 plat overlay. Now if you're doing a matched pair of whips, at this point with any whip really, this is when you're going to determine your colors, your color pattern. For this pair of whips, I'm going to be doing a coral snake pattern. Now the customer ordered for one whip to be red, yellow, and black, and the other red, yellow, and blue. But other than that, I'm just gonna make them the exact same. So it's gonna be the coral snake pattern. So go ahead and cut your strands, and depending on how you want the pattern to go, as you drop strands, you'll drop certain colors, which will change up the pattern. That's just, you know, it just happens with whip making. You can't keep the exact same pattern the whole way down. So you know, how you cut your strands to drop will affect your pattern, so just keep that in mind. So go ahead and gut them, and again, the 3 longest strands that are the same length, tie a knot in the exact middle, and the rest of the strands just you know, find the middle and stagger it about 4 inches. So I'm going to set up the coral snake pattern. So I'm actually going to take all the strands and wrap them around all at once. So what I want is for it to be 2 reds, a yellow, 2 blues, and a yellow. And if you're doing this, it really doesn't matter what goes on top, just as long as there's a yellow strand in between the set of blue and set of red. Okay, so I'm just going to start like this, and I'm going to wrap them all around at once. And this is, if you're doing a pattern like this where you have to wrap them all at once, it's kind of tricky to keep them from overlapping. So you can do it that way, but I'm actually going to take 3 of them and do it the other way for the sake of this video. Just cross those over. And then take these other strands and feed them through, and then I'll sort out the pattern once I get them all lined up. So just pull it till the knots stop it, and now I'm going to set up my pattern. So to do this coral snake, again, you want the yellow to separate the blue and red groups. So what it looks like right now with these strands pointing out to the sides, that's what the pattern's going to be. So you can see that when I hold these out, the blue is touching the red, so I need to take this yellow strand and put it between them. And get these knots lined up in the back. They don't have to be perfect, but just get them close. Okay, so the strand's sticking out on both sides. This will determine the pattern. So I have 2 blues, a yellow, 2 reds, a yellow. So the blue and red will not touch, and that's what I want. So now I can begin plaiting. So again, the bottom strand points to the upper right, so I'm going to take the top right and bring it around the back, go under 3 over 3. And this is a 12 plait. Now again, I'm doing the herringbone plait for the entire whip, so the whole whip has the coral snake pattern, but usually a whip will have a diamond plait. That's a pretty common one for a handle because it looks nicer as a handle. It's a different pattern. So later at the end I'll add a tutorial on how to do that. You know, it's not that much more difficult. For some people it can be tricky to learn, but anyway, just make sure you pay close attention when you're starting off, because with these strands they can easily overlap each other. But again, if you're doing a multiple colored pattern, it's not too hard to tell the difference. And again, don't pull too tight until you've plaited all the strands, giving each strand a full pass. So once, this is a 12 plait, so once I make 12 passes, then I'm going to slide this up and pull everything as tight as possible. Okay, so I've made a full pass, so I'm gonna slide this up as high as it can go and give each individual strand a nice tight pull. This is the portion we're going to be cutting off about 1 inch, so you want to pull these strands very tight so there's no chance of them unraveling or slipping whenever we cut it and bind off the end. And this is also where you're going to grip, so, or close to where you're going to grip, so you want it to be tight for that reason also. Okay, so as I've mentioned before, you want to work on keeping your cladding seam straight, and the overlay is definitely where you want to do that most, because you can see in the middle of the chevron pattern going, there's a seam, so you don't want that to be wiggling all around the whip. You want to keep it straight all the way down the whip. So the best way to do that is, as you braid, keep it close to the vise. So once you get, if you start to get, you know, far away from the vise, once you work your way down, then just slide it back up a little bit farther. So I'm going to braid down the handle, and I'll resume when I reach the transition. Okay, so I'm just above the transition here. So at this point, if you're making a matched pair of whips, right here would be a good place to stop and start your other whip. It's good. And something else I want to mention too, it'd be a good idea to put something in your vise, like a cloth, to keep the bare metal of the vise from doing anything to your overlay. Because I've done it before where I squeezed it too tight and the bare metal kind of crimped it and made some dents in it or whatever. Now it won't do any permanent damage. Of course, we'll be rolling it when we're done, but you know, it's just something to keep in mind. It helps a little bit. So I'm just gonna go ahead and clip these strands. Again, if you have hemostats, it's better for, you know, pausing, keeping your strands there, but if not, that's fine. Just wrap it with some tape or something. So I'll go ahead and start the other whip and braid down, do the transition, and then we'll pick up from there. Okay, so I've started the overlay on my other whip, and I'm several inches past the transition. So I'm getting ready to drop a strand here. I'm about 17 inches from the tip of the handle, and whenever you're doing the overlay of a matched set of whips, you want to switch between them every time you drop a strand, because if you remember in the other bellies, we just stuck a strand out, so by the time you finish the belly you could see exactly where you dropped strands. But for the overlay, when we drop strands, they're going to be laying underneath the braiding, so you're not really going to see where exactly you dropped them. So every time I drop a strand, then I'll switch over to the other whip, go down, drop that strand, and just do that down the whip, so I drop them in the exact same places. So I'm going to do a couple more passes. Again, I'm at 17 inches from the tip of the handle. And again, make sure that you keep the whip, you keep sliding it up towards the vise to keep your seam straight. And again, just check the back every once in a while to make sure that everything's okay back there. Okay, so I just brought this strand around, so I'm going to drop it. So I'll take the strand up on the right, cross it over, and I'm going to end up doing under 3/2. So well, first I'm going to go under 3/3, and in a couple more passes we'll end up dropping it. Okay, so when I go under 3/3 here, I'll be going, the first strand I'm going over is the strand I'm going to drop. So when I do under 3/3 like that, you can see here this strand is directly under the one I just brought around, so I'm going to bring the left one around. So now when I bring this one around to go under 3 which will be over 2, I'm going to take this drop strand, bring it under all the strands on the left side, and just lay it in with the core like that. Don't pull it tight or anything. So now you're going to take a strand up, do under 3/2. So now we're in 11 plat. And when you drop strands, it can easily create gaps, so make sure you pull good and tight, cinch everything up tight. And you can see this strand is on the side. We want to have it down the middle, so I'm going to carefully give it one last tug to the side, then put your thumb, put pressure just below it, because we're going to swing it to the middle, and we don't want to pull this down out of the braiding. So put some pressure just below it where it is braided in, carefully swing it over, and it might take a couple passes to get it pushed over. So go under 3/3 on the right side, and on the left side under 3/2. Swing it over a little bit more, and it's now in the center. Now we're not going to leave it this long. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and cut it so that there's only about another inch left or so. Try to cut it at a slight angle too. Just helps encourage a smoother taper. So we don't want to be in an uneven plat for very long, where one side is under 3/2, the other one is under 3/3. So we're going to be dropping the next strand on the other side, because remember, that's why we staggered it, so it's not at the exact same time, but close. Okay, so this is the next strand to drop. So I'm actually going to bring it up so I can pass it around one more time before I do that. And I'll just go ahead and skip over to that. Okay, so I've just brought this strand around for a pass, so I'm going to secure it in place by doing a couple more passes until it comes up, until it's the third strand from the bottom up. It's basically what I'm looking for. So just braid a couple more passes till it does that. And you can see why we don't want to go very long without dropping a strand, because when it's uneven on each side, you can see how the braiding, it's shorter on this side than it is on this side. You can see that there. So just one more pass, and Now this is the fourth strand from the bottom up, so the next pass is going to change that. So go ahead and bring it below to the core, take your strand around and go under 3 over 2. Okay, give that a little tug and slightly bring it over to the middle. Not all the way just yet. Do another pass or two. Now I pulled a little bit too hard and it shifted slightly, but not enough to affect anything with the whip. I can easily push that back and make sure that the strand right below that strand that was dropped, so you can see I dropped, this is the strand that's dropped, strand right below it, give that a good tight pull and that'll prevent it from slipping down out of place. So go ahead and line that up with the core. And now we're in a 10 plat. I'm not used to braiding with the camera, that's why I keep bumping it. It's not as easy as it seems. And you can see now that the pattern is not the same. As I mentioned before, it's, you're going to drop strands on a whip, so the pattern is not going to be the same the entire length of the whip. So I'm going to go ahead and cut, leave about an inch and a half. And I'm going to do a couple more passes, but I'm going to leave just the tip of the dropped strand sticking out. So then I'll switch over to my other whip and do the exact same thing, drop the strand in the exact same place. Again, you want to, for every step of the way, switch over to the other whip. Because if a matched set of whips, any slight difference can cause it to be harder for two-handed whip cracking or whatever you're trying to do. You want them to be as identical as possible in size, weight, the taper. So I'm just going to stop there, get my other whip in the vise, and do the exact same thing. Okay, so right now I'm 27 inches from the tip of the handle, and it's time to drop another strand. Now, depending on what your experience with whips are, you may have quite a bit of length in your strands left. I made the strands just a little bit extra longer because a common problem with beginner whip makers is they just don't pull tight enough and their strands end up too short and their whip ends up being shorter. And so if you're noticing your strands are a little extra longer, that's fine because we're trimming them anyway. But I'm going to be dropping these two yellow strands, and again, every time you drop a strand, check it, start the other whip if you're making a matched pair. So I'm going to go ahead and drop the strand on the left first, and it's right in the middle here. I'm going to be going from 10 plat down to a 9 plat for now, so I'm going to take the strand to the upper right, bring it around the back, and I'm going to go ahead, since this is the third strand from the bottom up, gonna tuck it under through the core, so now we'll do under 2 over 2 on this side. And on the other side it's under 3 over 2 for now. And I'll do another pass over here to kind of push that strand over. And give the strand right below the drop strand a good tug. And swing this drop strand over to the middle. Kind of need to adjust your other strands. Okay, so do several passes. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and cut this. I'll leave maybe ½ an inch or so. Just about like that. Because I'm going to go ahead and drop this other strand. So I'm just going to work it up until it's in a position where I would cross under it, but then I'll drop it then. You'll see what I mean here in a second. Okay, so now I would do under 3 over 2, and this dropped strand would go over top, but I'm going to drop it, so bring it down to the middle, and I'm going to go over top of it, so under 2 over 2, which if I left that strand in there, it would be under 2 over 3. So I'll do a pass or two and then tighten it up and swing it to the middle. You gotta make sure, keep your seam straight. And whenever you do that, when you check it with the top of the handle, because if you go off a little about here and you check it with here, you'll go off more and it eventually just twists the whole way around the whip. I've done that with a couple of them before. And again, make sure that when you drop strands, especially when you drop strands, check the back side of your whip. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to cut it, leaving about half an inch, 3/4 of an inch. And I'm going to get the other whip and go down to that point. It's not too much farther down. So take my hemostats and switch over. And again, leave that drop strand sticking out so you can see exactly where you need to drop. Okay, so at this point I'm at 32 inches, and I'm gonna go ahead and drop another strand. Even though sometimes strands don't look like they need to be dropped, you need to take into account the overall length of the whip, and you want the strands to drop relatively evenly, because you know this is only a 4-foot whip. So if I'm only gonna do to where I come down to 4 strands, that leaves me with just 2 more drops to do. So I kind of need to divide it up, and as you make more whips you'll get more experience with that, but for now you can just follow the measurements till you get an idea of how often you need to drop strands to get the right taper for the whip, because you don't want it to be thick to slowly taper and then at the very end taper real fast, or just the opposite. You want it to taper evenly the whole way down. So again, I'm at 32 inches and I'm going to drop these 2 red strands. So I'm going to drop the one on the right side first. Well, let's go ahead and do the left side. I'm going to need to back up 1 pass. One pass on each side. So I'm going to be going into a 6 plat. So I'm going to go ahead and drop that. Bring this around, or I'm sorry, bring this around, and then take the top right one, go under 2 over 1, and now I'm in a 6 plat, or right now a 7 plat. And the next shortest strand I'm going to go ahead and drop. So normally I'd go under 2 over 2, but the short strand is here, so I'm going to drop that and go under 2 over 1. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and cut the strand that we dropped first, leave about 1/2 inch sticking out again. Now this second strand that we dropped here, now that we're in an even 6 plat, we are not going to cut it, because you can see here, this is all we have left of our core. So this drop strand is going to become our new core once we get off of this, which I'll actually cut off to encourage a better taper once we get closer towards the end of it. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop right here with this pass and get the other whip and go down to this point and drop the other strand, and then keep on braiding. Just braid down until you get close to the end of this core. Okay, so I'm on my other whip, and you can see I only have a couple inches of the original core left, and here I have this drop strand as the core. I'll take a quick measurement. From the tip of the handle, I'm about 35.5 inches, so just under 3 feet. At this point, I'm gonna cut this core off, so you can see I have it wrapped, the artificial sinew from binding. I'm going to cut it just below that. Make sure you cut it at an angle too. Okay, so now our core will be thinner, so that'll encourage more of a taper. And before I go over that, I'm going to get an exact measurement so I can cut it at the same point on the other whip. So I cut it at exactly 3 feet long. So just if you're making another whip, go over to that one, measure out 3 feet, and cut it there or mark it. And continue braiding for several more inches. If you're doing 4-plait, or if you're ending the whip in a 4-point fall hitch, which will be ending with 4 strands, then you're going to want about 10 inches, the last 10 inches to be in 4-plait. Now if you're doing a 6-point fall hitch, which would end in a 6-plait here, you won't drop any more strands. You'll just braid down over the core till you reach the end of your whip. But this is a 4-foot whip, and with whips that are under 6 feet, they end better in a 4-point fall hitch, because as short as the whip is, a 6-point fall hitch doesn't taper as much. So with it being so short, you want it to taper as much as possible, because there's not as much length to roll out, so it can easily be much stiffer. So if you're doing anything less than 6 feet long, I'd recommend that you do a 4-point fall hitch. If you're doing a 6-point fall hitch, you have to braid over a core the entire length, so make sure that with this core it measures out to at least 1 inch longer than your desired length. If not, there's an easy fix for that. Just grab a scrap piece of paracord that is definitely long enough, and what you're going to do, you're just going to lay it on top like this, and just imagine that this is your core, and just braid over it. And you'll see what I mean here in a minute. This is a common practice, adding strands. Sometimes whip makers want to go from a smaller plait to a higher plait, and they'll add a strand and incorporate it into their plaiting, but this is for our core, in case yours isn't long enough. So what you're going to do maybe about 1 inch of braiding, and then what you're going to do is carefully slide this down. Once you have some braiding, you'll slide it down under just below the braiding, and it's tightly seated in there, and as you braid down, you're holding it in there, so now you have a new core, and you can cut the shorter one out. So you can do, that's an easy fix if your core happens to be too short. But again, I'm going to end this in a 4-point fall hitch, so you don't need the core to run the entire length of the whip. Okay, so I'm going to want to drop the strands at 3 feet and about 3 feet 2 inches, maybe 3 foot 3 inches, give or take 1 inch. So I'm at 3 feet 1 inch. So I'm going to go down a couple of more inches. And again, if you're doing a 6-point fall hitch, don't worry about dropping, just braid on down to the end of the whip, and then we'll do the fall hitch. We're going to do a couple more passes. Okay, so I'm going to get an exact measurement, the overall length of the whip up to this point. I'm going to take it out of the vise so I can stretch it out. And I'm at 3 feet 2.5 inches, so that's perfect for this. So I'm gonna put it up in the vise again. So we're gonna go from a 6 plat down to a 4 plat now. So these last 3 strands, I made them the same length in case you want to do a 6-point fall hitch, so you can decide what color you want to drop. So I'm going to drop the red. I think I'll end it with blue and yellow. So just going to go ahead and drop this red strand on the left, bring this around, just go under 1 over 1. And when you're going from a 6 plat down to the 5 and 4 plat, it's very easy to get a pretty bad looking overlap or a gap. So you really want to take your time with this, pull tight, scooch everything up and everything, just, you know, it takes some adjusting. And you don't really want to go any more than 1 pass without dropping another strand. And go ahead and cut your core out. That drop strand is now your new core. Make sure you pull good and tight. And whenever you cut a strand, don't worry about it fraying and sticking out through the braiding. We'll fix that. You can just run a flame over it real quick to singe it at whenever you finish the whip. It's an easy fix. It's just one of the finishing touches of the whip that you do. Okay, so I'm gonna cut the core as close as I can without cutting the actual strands. And drop this last red strand and be in a 4 plat. And again, pay close attention to what you're doing on the dropping of this last strand, because it's very easy to get a nasty looking gap in there. Okay, so now that we're established in our 4-plat, I'm going to cut the core at the desired length, and because we're going for the last 5 inches or so, I want to be braiding over nothing. That's the nice thing about a 4-plat. You can braid over no core and it's nice and round. But a 6-plat or more, it's too bulky and gets kind of square looking. So go ahead and lay your whip out and measure so that you have from the tip of the handle to your core, go to, let's see, I'm going to do about 3 feet 7 inches, or 6 inches. So there's going to be 6 inches of braiding over no core. And remember, we're going to cut off an inch off the handle, so whenever we compensate for that inch, there's actually going to be an extra inch. So do 3 foot 7, measuring from the tip of the handle. Okay, so there, when we cut the tip of the handle off, there will be 6 inches of the braided portion, but just to make things easier, I'm just giving measurements from the very tip of the handle. So from the tip of the handle, cut your core at 3 foot 7. And at this point, go ahead over to your other whip if you're doing that. And as you can see, I still had to go over the core and drop some strands, so I'll skip up to that. Okay, so I've braided my other whip down to this point, cut the core so that there will be 6 inches of braiding over no core. So just continue this 4-plat, and we'll just braid right on over it as if nothing happened, and just continue this until you come to 4 feet 1 inch, or whatever the length of your whip is, 1 inch past that, because remember, we're cutting an inch off of the handle. And again, make sure you're braiding very tight, because if this is loose, it'll be kind of like a Chinese finger trap. I have a whip that I didn't braid very tight down at the 4-plat, so it's actually slides, the whole portion slides up and down, it stretches. So make sure you pull as tight as you can, especially as we're transitioning off of the core. And now I'm braiding over nothing. And at this point, it's very easy to get your strands twisted to where you get little kinks in them. So make sure when you bring the strand around, it doesn't twist or anything. Okay, so just continue in this until you come to 1 inch past the finished length of the whip. Okay, so I'm at the 4 feet 1 inch mark, so the overlay braiding is complete. So now we're going to make our fall and our fall hitch. So you can either use hemostats to clip this off, or you don't, just take one of the strands and do a half hitch knot just to kind of hold it. You don't have to pull it very tight. So there's 2 ways that you can make a fall. The one, you'll need a lacing needle, and it depends what kind you have. This is a Permalock needle I got from Tandy Leather Company. This works great for knots, but what we're going to do basically is the one way, the better way of making a fall is you basically put the paracord in the end, and then you're going to feed it through itself. So some brands and different types of paracord, different colors even, are slightly tighter than another. So some paracord won't let you fit certain lacing needles through. You know, you can just poke through and pull, and you can see that went in a little ways, but that's all it'll do. This isn't going to go through anymore. So if you're going to buy a lacing needle, make sure that you get a different type than this. I believe it's microcord lacing needle. I'll put a description in exactly what kind to get. It's a smaller kind, and it can very easily fit through paracord. So if you're gonna buy one, buy that kind. So anyway, I'll first show you the easy way to make it, and the other way. This way to make it, you need the gut in your paracord. So to measure out, there's different lengths of falls for different types of whips. It all depends on how your whip tapers, how quickly it tapers. Usually a fall is between 16 inches and 2 feet. You really don't want to do any shorter or longer than that. The reason you need different lengths for falls is because if it's too short for a whip, the whip will jerk a lot, or if it's too long, there'll be too much drag when you crack it. It just takes some time and experience, so it's always best to cut a little bit longer than you need, try it out, and trim it, accordingly. For these 4-foot whips, a 20-inch fall works pretty good. So again, this is the easier way of making a fall. So measure out 22 inches because we're going to be tying a knot. And basically you're gonna cinch the end, but what you're gonna do is just do a simple knot, just fold it over and pull it through just like that, and then you can cut this close to it, singe it, and you have sort of a slip knot. Okay, so that's the first way. The other way, like I said with the lacing needle, if you don't have a lacing needle, or you have one like mine and it just doesn't work, an alternative way is get a small nail, something like this, one that'll fit inside paracord, and measure out your paracord to be twice the length, because it's going to double through itself. So I want it to be 20 inches, so go to 40 and then give an extra inch for the loop, so total of 41 inches. Cut it and gut it. Okay, so take your nail and put it down in the paracord. Well, first, I should, before you do that, file the tip so it doesn't cut through. Don't have to do it too much. Okay, so put it down in your paracord. Make sure you have the tip or the point of the nail sticking up. And slide it down in so you have a little bit of room on top. And we're going to singe the end. Make sure I'm in view there. Singe the end of the paracord. And you want to roll it to a point. So just lick your fingers and roll it quickly. The more you do this, the more calloused your fingers get to it, but if not, just roll it on the table with the end of your lighter or something. Okay, so now that you've done that, slide the nail up to that point and singe the tip a little bit more so it contracts. Try to get it good and pointed. Okay, so next what you're going to do is find the middle of your paracord. And once you have that, take your Permalock needle or something to poke through and start a hole. Okay, just like that. And take your nail, and as soon as you slide this out, stick this through the hole. Okay, so it's in itself. And make sure before you do it any further, get all the twists out of this. You don't want this to be twisted. Make sure it's straight. So I need to twist mine a little bit. Okay, so now we're just gonna feed this through. Okay, just kind of shimmy it. And this is basically what we would do if we had the right size lacing needle, only it would be longer and overall an easier and faster process. But again, if you have little nails like these, they work just fine using this method. And you're just going to do this until this loop closes up. Just do it little by little. Okay, so pull this out and slide the slack, close up the loop. Don't do it completely. You want to leave a little bit sticking out because this is going to slide over the thong of the whip. Okay, leave just a little eye like that. So pinch that and run the slack out towards the end this way. You want this fall to be tight. Okay, so I have an eye about that big. So now cut just below the nail. Okay, so I'm gonna cut it right about there and singe the end. And when you singe the end of this, you don't want to roll it to a point. You actually want it to be a little bulky on the end because we'll be tying our cracker on here and you don't want it to slip off, so just get something like that there. Okay, so that's how you make the fall. Now we'll go ahead and put it on. Okay, Okay, so at this point, we're gonna take our fall and open up this eye. Don't worry, it won't come through because we singed it. Open it up and put all the last 4 strands over it, or through it like that, and then just grab it from the end and cinch the loop back up as tight as it'll go, and slide that up out of the way for now. You can undo this half hitch if you did one. So now we're going to do the fall hitch, which is just a series of half hitch knots. So you can do, if you have more than one color, you can do, you know, a series of colors. Like with this one, I alternated the blue and yellow. So I'm going to start with black. Just bring it around the back, then come up from the top and down through. Now don't pull these knots tight just yet. Just get them snug. Okay, so now I'll do a yellow around the back, down through the top. Okay, so now that we've done all that, we're going to take the last strand. You can tighten it up a little more. It doesn't have to be super loose. You're going to singe the end of this so that you can feed it into your lacing needle. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go up under all these strands, including the fall, and this is going to secure the fall hitch. So make sure you do this on your last strand, and you're going to go over to the left side. Don't go under itself. Go start under the next one. Make sure you're on the left side of the half hitch knots. Okay, so come under these 3 and the fall. Come out the top, and we can go ahead and take this off. Don't pull it all the way just yet. Leave some slack. So now we're gonna, you want to make sure you pull these in the right order. So take the first one, in this case it's black, the top one, pull it snug, not too tight. Then the next one, which is yellow, and then the next, and then the last one you're gonna pull like this. You don't pull this yet. We leave a loop so we can pull it down first. Then pull the fall. Okay, now we'll go through the same steps again, only pulling tighter. Because if you do it all too tight at once, it crimps everything up and it just doesn't look as good. So you want to do this at least 3 different times to get the best quality look. And the last time, just pull as hard as you can. Okay, now we'll pull this up through. Try to make sure there's no twists. Okay, just like that. So we'll go through everything one more time. The fall, then the top half hitch knot. Just kind of squeeze it as you pull it. Okay, so now you take your fall and get it up out of the way because we're going to trim all the strands and we don't want to cut the fall. So cut them all about 1 inch so you have nice looking tassels. and then just singe the ends of them. Just kind of flatten them. Okay, so now we'll do this strand on top. Cut it about, leave about 1 millimeter sticking out the top. And then we'll singe that too, but you want to be very careful not to get your whip, so just kind of bend it like that. And just melt the tip of that. And you don't want to press it in or anything, just leave it the way it is. Okay, so now you can take your whip out of the vise. And we are done braiding the overlay of the whips. So now that we've done that, we're going to bind off the ends of the handles and cut them.